Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Prateep, for taking out your valuable times. I know you're traveling now. Prateep is going to Cape Town, and Derek is going back home because he is also an administrator.
And communities and resource use strategies adapted to drivers of socio-ecological change. He has many publications to his credit. Let us have a round of applause for Professor Armitage. Professor Prateep Nayak is a professor at School of Environment and director of V2V research group funded by Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Canada. He does transdisciplinary work with an active interest in combining social and ecological perspectives. Prateep's research focuses on the understanding of complex human-environment connections and disconnections with particular attention to change, its drivers, their influence, and possible ways to deal with them. His main areas of expertise and interest include commons, governance, socio-ecological system resilience, well-being, environmental justice, and political ecology. Currently, he teaches international development and environment. Prateep is a past Trudeau Scholar, a Harvard Giorgio Ruffalo Fellow in Sustainability Science, a recipient of Canada's Governor-General Academic Gold Medal, and SSHRC Banting Fellow. He has many outstanding publications to his credit, including a much-cited volume on commons published by Routledge. Let us have a round of applause. So we present his book to our guests.
So we can have.
Much for the opportunity. This is so wonderful to be here. And Derek has already mentioned about it. And one thing that amazes me, is the diversity of topics that you are working, on, and quite a range. The second thing that amazed me is that I could relate to each one of you in terms of my own understanding and my own research. And I will explain that in a bit. I think the importance of engaging in historical analysis cannot be more important at a time when we're seeing so massive and difficult processes of change, because the way we understand change and to proceed further in responding to those changes, a lot of the answers lies in understanding what happened in the past. And at the same time, a lot of people, in the academia and beyond, have moved away from that analysis. Looking into future doesn't require them to account for what happened in the past. So I think it is time to kind of look at the process of change in the past, and therefore look into the current, and therefore look at what could be the possible trends into the future itself. Some of that I have reflected in my own work. My own PhD is not very far from here compared to where I come from and we come from. It's Odisha, Chilika Lagoon, Bay of Bengal, where I started to engage as a PhD students. As we talk, I realize it's getting old and old. I'm talking about almost 20, close to 20 years now. About 15 to 17 years now. I engaged in my research process to understand how people, get themselves involved into responding to changes, which is not of their own making. So they are responding to change that they are not responsible for why it happened. And it's a difficult process. If I am responsible for a change, and it's a different process of responding to that. But if I am not responsible, it is imposed on me, then to respond to that change is very difficult and very new. And so I started to look at what is causing change in small fishing communities, and how are they reluctantly or not so reluctantly engaging in responding to those changes. And then I get to understand the answer to those response mechanisms predominantly lies in the past. And so I dug into the history of that, not being a history student, to find that many of the things that they were responding to are based on what rights they had, like 300 years back, and what their struggles were. And to my surprise, many of the fishers that I worked would tell us life is more difficult in independent India under the current political situation rather than the king's time. So they would refer to benevolent kings and how rights were protected, how there were no competition because it is a caste divided society. If you belong to a fishing caste, nobody would encroach into your occupation and your areas of occupation. It means physically the area, like fishing grounds, because you are a fisher by caste. It was so well respected. So I learned all of those things from an historical perspective in my own way. Learned also about some of the social mobilization and social movements around how the landscape in which rural people live are interconnected, as our lives are interconnected. We are interconnected as people. So there are social revolutions, or social movements around macho and gacha. Macho is fish and gacha is tree. So there was no singular movement around fish or tree, but there are many movements that combined different landscapes and different resources. Macho and gacha, or fish and tree movement, is a unique movement in that area, in the Chilika Lagoon in the Bay of Bengal, which combines the terrestrial forest systems and the rights in the forest and also in the waters. So I also started to learn about how change drives a motivation to understand this interconnected nature of the world. So many of us, myself included, we work on this integrated nature of things. So we say, how society is integrated into ecology and vice versa, how cultures are integrated into, economies. So I started to look at these integrations, and one of the reflections from what you talked about, also relates to this process of my process of researching change and understanding change. And the third element I would mention is when there is a change and response to change, it is for something. It is not without a meaning. So the response to change is often meant to not so much about moving away from change, but to take the change along with their struggles to create new novel things. So what is that? In some of our recent work, and both Derek and me have been involved in a massive project, and Derek, Vipul is also part of it. We're looking at change happens, response to change comes in because people don't give up so easily. But then that response leads to ability in many terms. So I'll give you a card on that, so you can explore more. The core idea is wherever there is vulnerability, wherever there is negative change, there is also avenues and opportunities for moving towards something. And if that was not there, then we will be in a stagnant society. So because that hope and that opportunity is there, so we are trying to explore. Communities are trying to explore, people that we research with in the local places and the context also are motivated by that. So vulnerabilities, marginalizations, and exclusion, and all of those things that you talked about, which are in many ways rooted in the history, provides that impetus to look into the future itself. And that's why methodologically, history provides the impetus to look into the future in many ways itself. So I have been engaged in those kind of work over the past several now I can say decade, more than a decade or 2 decades or something. I have a background in working in forest as a practitioner, but then when I moved into my PhD, I started to work in the aquatic systems of fishes. But then, being an interconnected, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary kind of person, I never look at these things as distinct from each other or disconnected from each other. And that's the kind of challenge that I have taken up. And that keeps my motivation going. So yeah, wonderful work. I congratulate of course, I know Vipul's work and Vipul's personality, and I'm not surprised that he is able to bring this, very distinct fields of, topics, represented through your, research areas, and hold you all together, as the center point, So congratulations to you as well.
Being given the opportunity to visit you and the university today, I really appreciate it. It just reminds me, I have a cohort of doctoral students right now that I'm teaching in one of our core classes in my program. They come from very rich backgrounds, and it's very diverse, and just it reminds me of the joy of where many of you are right now, or have just recently passed through and getting your PhD. And it's a wonderful time. It comes with many, many challenges, but intellectually it's so stimulating, and it brings me back to my own doctoral program so long ago. So I feel like I need at least a year to spend, because there's like 12 or 13 of you, and one a month. I think we could spend time learning from each other and hearing more about your work. So I'm sorry we don't have more time to do that. I guess one of the things that jumps out at me right away is that so much of across many of the topics you're sharing is this idea of narratives, and challenging narratives, and understanding different narratives of change, of people, and their contested narratives of how we understand environments and how they've been co-produced, between ecological drivers of change and the way people intersect with that. So I'm really quite fascinated by this common theme that I feel anyway that I'm hearing, is this idea of thinking really carefully through these narratives, because they have such power in terms of shaping what we do now, how we project outward in terms of our policies and actions, and how we plan urban spaces and our environments and things like that. It brings me back to, again, my own doctoral work quite a few years ago. I was looking at this idea of environmental change in the uplands and the coastal spaces of a particular place in Indonesia, and really trying to understand sort of why local people were being, essentially in a very simplified way, why local people were being suggested that they were responsible for the types of environmental changes that were taking place. And if we unpack that both in the uplands, because there's shifting cultivators, very quickly seen, well, these are the reasons why the forests are disappearing, is because these people chop down the forest, but ultimately is really because of cocoa production, the marketization of new products and commodities really driving those upland changes. And similarly, in the coastal spaces, I was looking at aquaculture and the loss of mangrove systems, and of course the main people being accused of removing mangroves were local people, local inhabitants, customary people. But ultimately it was, if we unpack that process, you realize it really reflects global markets actually driving aquaculture production, which was leading people, new entrants into that system, and leading to all sorts of ecological damages. So in both those cases it was really challenging the narratives. And although I'm not a historian, I recall certainly drawing on a lot of historical work and historical analysis, and so I really appreciate the kinds of work that you do in helping us understand very modern ecological nature society challenges, essentially. So thank you very much. Places they, of course, historically and customarily had all sorts of relationships with. So we have this modernization push, but at the same time we are, and states very much are understanding that if we're going to be sustainably stewarding resources, we need to be thinking back to how things were done in more historical times. And that means working in a Canadian context when it comes to things like fisheries and forests and aquatic systems, really learning from Indigenous peoples and how they customarily stewarded resources, and the values and the principles that they use. So there's this recognition by states that what is historically, how we've historically managed resources has failed, and so we're looking for new solutions, and these solutions reflect much more complex understanding of that relationship with history, with past societies, and how they engage with their places. So there is change happening, and it's very challenging, of course, because in a fisheries context, we have this process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, which means fisheries resources are being given back to Indigenous communities, coastal communities, in different ways. But that's creating tensions with individuals from mainstream society that have more conventional commercial fishing rights, and so these are very, very challenging processes, but they are taking place for sure. Yeah.
Sir, I had a question. Sorry, this So, whenever you watch a BBC documentary or a National Geographic documentary, you see angling being promoted, sockeye salmon traveling to their homelands to lay eggs, and those big furry grizzly bears, hunting those fishes. And it's like that they are selling the idea that life is good over there, and somehow the native indigenous are not part of the discourse. They are not presented there. So, do you think that this is a very capitalistic idea of leisure, and from there the natives don't have a say in it, and maybe this will promote tourism, but the native rights would be, would be taken out?
I think in any documentary, any source, as Prateep was saying, we should be skeptical of the narrative that we're maybe being given. Certainly there are like recreational angling and things like that, and tourism in a place like British Columbia, where there are sockeyes and grizzlies. That's why people go, to go see nature. But of course, nature is an outcome of centuries and long history of interaction with indigenous people. The forests that we see now, the sockeye salmon runs that we see, are an outcome of long histories and connections with indigenous peoples. So they are playing a role. Indigenous peoples have a very significant role now in making decisions about what's happening with grizzlies and what's happening with sockeye. They're at the forefront of management plans, of co-managing essentially these resources. So I'm not sure sort of what perspective you're being given, but there are a lot of changes taking place for sure, and there is a pushback against a purely capitalist form of production and consumption in places where indigenous peoples are regaining some of their rights and tenure and authority. So we have in Canada, in different parts, we have what are called comprehensive land claims agreements, and so these are a return to indigenous peoples of broad, massive territories of land, where they actually have enshrined in law the rights to co-manage resources, including wildlife and things like that. So these are hard-won outcomes, governance outcomes that have taken decades to come together, but they're changing the nature of the conversation. But it's no panacea. It's not a simple solution to these things, but there are changes.
I was watching this documentary 2 years ago. I think it was Hassan Minhaj interviewing Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau. So he was referring to him as the White Panther and he was referring Canada as Wakanda. But anyways, the point being, he asked him a pointed question that you have allowed oil drilling rights in native Indian communities. So did they go with it? Were they able to implement that thing?
No, there's all sorts of challenges. There's all sorts of what is formally happening, the legal process, the expectations, the governance changes that are taking place. They're not smooth. So we have all sorts of conflicts and situations. We have pipelines that are being built across Canada to transport natural gas. Those are going through Indigenous lands. But you have to remember, Indigenous communities are not homogenous, right? We have some Indigenous communities that are very much pro-environment and pro-customary historical traditions of management, and those are the elders and the chiefs and councils. But you also have groups of Indigenous people that are very much pro-economic development. So you have conflicts within Indigenous communities as well, which makes it very challenging. So there's no, I'd be very cautious of any single explanation or narrative or sort of perspective of what's happening on some of these themes.
So in a way, the term like sustainability is quite a modern term. So the time period which I am working on, roughly 16 to 18, early 18th century. So in a way, once we're talking about the concept of sustainability, we're also reflecting the fact that there is also exploitation in a way. So I don't know how far this concept can be applicable to my time period. Somehow this is also, I myself realize that the work on environmental history or ecology, let's say, are more modern dominated time period interest. So during time of my MPhil research also, I realized that there's very hardly secondary work which really not type on urbanity, but let's say environmental concerns or challenges during the early modern time period, roughly let's say 13th to early 18th centuries. So how many historians or let's say environmentalists also, they focus on the environmental zone is quite limited, I say. So if you're talking about the concept of sustainability, how can I use the same term and methodology in my time period? Let's say urbanity. If I'm exploring urbanization, or let's say the ecological part of capital city formation.
Yeah. Just quickly, I mean, one thing that I and many of us do in our work is to contextualize those terms, not only in place but also temporally. Okay. For example, I was studying change, and then the buzzword is climate change. Until now, in my 20 years of working in Bay of Bengal coast, I've not been able to understand what do those communities mean by climate change. Even does climate change even matter to them? That's not a narrative. That's not a term that they use. They talk about all sorts of change, and changing climate is one of them. But they don't talk about climate change in terms of temperature rise or glaciers melting and all those kind of things. But they do talk about change in the climate as it impacts their livelihoods, as there impacts in their fishing practices. So there is a different way of saying this. So I think if we take some of these modern terms into the historical period to say, okay, how was sustainability there? No, you may not find any of that. So how do you deal with it? It's a methodological question. How do you deal with it? You have to then see what was the motivation for people to engage in certain things, and that's a lot of us do. Like there could be, you could say, we say viability in our work. Some people say resilience. Some people say development. Some people say other things.
In a way, also it's kind of a challenge historically also regarding the sources. So from a historical point of view, for the medieval time period, let's say early modern period, there are very limited sources that directly talks about the environmental ecology.
Yeah.
Apart from that, the scientific works which so far have been done, somehow they're also confined to the more modern movements and the ecological challenge.
Yeah.
Prior to early modern time period, I think very rarely, I don't know, if not in my knowledge, that any kind of scientific study has been done on the changing environmental or challenging aspect. I don't know.
So the two things I would say to that. One, there were studies, but the nature of studies were very different, and I encountered that in my own work. So what we relied on in terms of knowing what was the rights of people, who were the fishing communities, what were the significant problems so we relied on survey reports of British whatever, you can't call them scientists, but they are as scientific as the modern scientific reports. So there is a report in Chilika where Lord somebody who was assigned with the duties of defining how many fishers are there, who are the fishing people. So he went from this corner to the other corner, how many months or years, and generated a survey report which talks about who are these fishing people, what were the assets that made them fishing people. So that survey report tells how many boats were there, what kind of fishing gears were there, what areas were within their limits or within their rights regime. All of these things, do we take that as a scientific report or not? I would say yes, why not? Because there was absence of other kinds of reports at that time, but also it was scientifically done. Like it was surveyed. This person is on a few months of journey with a team of people doing surveys, talking to people, and documenting all of that. So we have to kind of see the nature of the documents. We can't say, oh, it's a survey report, therefore it is not scientific enough. The second one is, see, when people do something, in the historical time, maybe they're not using resilience or viability or sustainability or development or all those jargons, but there was a motivation for which they were doing. So, for my understanding as a researcher, if I'm saying, okay, now sustainability, what is that? It is basically why people do what they do for what end. Okay, so that what end could be sustainability, could be resilience, could be anything. It's basically oriented towards responding to adversities making meaningful, additions to their lives and the society and the, so something like that. So you have to have a kind of a more explanatory, and analytical, of course, way of, capturing that rather than just trying to capture that within a particular jargon, I would say.
If I can just maybe add, so I would agree, and I think the challenge is really more about methodology. And trying to understand this historical context, I would agree that the term, the idea, the concept that we have now is less useful. What's more important is really thinking creatively about, from a methodological standpoint, how can you really think about different sources of information and data, and they can come from many, many different ways. And just as one example, I have a PhD student now, not my own, but in the class that I teach. He's an Indigenous student, and he's very interested in sort of thinking about change of coastal estuaries in Nova Scotia, Canada. And so he has a background in the biological sciences and hydrology, and so he's doing paleo reconstructions using sediment cores, right? So, drilling down and looking at the layers of sand and silt and all that, and you understand how the change in those estuaries has taken place through time and what that means for people. But his argument is, but that's only part of the story, and we don't really understand where's the Indigenous perspectives on these changes. And so he's going to spend much of his PhD linking this paleo reconstructions, a very typical scientific record of change, with oral traditions and understandings from elders of what's happened in those estuaries through time. And so the data, if you will, is of course not a report, it's not a physical entity, it's going to be through story and through long-term histories and things like that. So it's a very creative way to weave together different knowledge systems and ways of understanding the world and try and understand what actually is happening now. And there are all sorts of implications for sustainability and resilience and the adaptive capacity of communities. But those are the jargony terms of today, not needed to understand the ideas of change through time from a methodological standpoint.
So I had another question. So it's a very generic question, and it's regarding the fishing concerns that we have right now. So for example, the capitalist system pushes trawler fishing practices. So many of the fishermen in India, they are now changing to cage fishing. In Bengal, I've read that some of them have adapted to prawn fishing as well, and economically it benefits them, but in a way it is more individualistic enterprise. Community is being put to neglect. So how do you see this change, and do you think that this change is resilient? Can it survive climate change? For example, we have biofloc practice emerging in India. Pond fishing is on the decline. Rather, we have fancy new kinds of fishing arrangements that are emerging. So do you think they are sustainable, and are they resilient?
Sustainability is a loaded term, and for that reason many other terms we use are loaded terms. In our own analysis, we find that when some people benefit, there are others that lose out. It's the rule of the society. Anywhere you go, the society as a whole will never benefit from anything you do, and that's a fact. You can't change it. So we study, yes, there is sustainability, resilience, power, and all of those things that we want for in the communities that we work for. But the reality of the fact is, whenever there is one group, so that we study how the upward mobility, economic and social mobility of some people because of certain things automatically leads to the downward mobility of certain other people. So some people becoming rich means, so it's a constant process. So how do you study sustainability within that kind of a context? Because what might be, whatever that term means, may be real for certain groups of people, but not others. Like your canal system that you're studying, is it running by the rich farmer's field or the poor? You are finding that it is always by the rich farmer's field. Okay, so how do you study those terms is in this fluctuating and ever dynamic, and changing kind of context itself. There are two strands of research that is going on, or debates that are going on. One, because as I said, not only indigenous communities, but no other communities, not all entire government is cohesive, in nature. So at certain periods of time, there are dominant narratives and dominant interventions that take precedence over the other. Okay, so what we are seeing now in fisheries, we are seeing from a very multi-species, fishing, practice. Now it is becoming single. If not single, then target species. So you have one or two, like you do shrimp, crab, or you do only one type of fish.
Carps.
Culture.
Anyway, yes, and then the third element is the aquaculture is taking over the capture fishing. The natural fishing is almost, there was some data at the conference that we were there. It is almost going to take over in India. Okay, aquaculture, yeah. So do you call it, so because if you look at fishing as a productive system only, like it, you catch fish, you sell, you talk about how many people eat the fish. That's a different system than if you try to understand fishing as a not only an economic system but also a cultural identity, political and environmental system. Then you have to look at, okay, production doesn't matter. So when aquaculture takes over, it's not the fish that are taking over the wild fish, but it is the fish space, the places, so how many of these customary, traditional fishing, natural fishing grounds are being converted into aquaculture is a question. So it is, so you have to study. So I would say there is meaning in studying those intersections in the dynamic nature of things rather than studying a particular subject or a target, because there is, you will not find good answers to that. Okay, so and then I'm going back to some of the work that we do. We are engaged always in this process. Because
It's an ongoing process. Rather.
There is no absolute answers. The moment you find an answer or a response, it is opening up bigger gates for more questions, more problems, more. So it is a constant process itself. Just finish in a minute. We're looking at combinedly. You're looking at a more than 1,000 year, 1,000 years of history in your different topics. Okay, so we're looking at that much into the past itself. So how do you do it? So yeah, I mean it's very challenging.
So I was saying whatever you were saying, that I happened to be in Odisha a few years back, festival Balas of Sandhi.
That's my hometown.
So in their fields, okay. So I have seen that there people were like they were doing this aquaculture more frequently. Like they were not. Apart from that agricultural activity, they were indulging these kind of things. And I was just thinking that are these only the fishermen communities who are doing this? Of course not, I guess.
Exactly.
Which I inquired, so they were saying no, they are not only fishermen, but everybody is doing this for these economic purposes. So what you were saying, that this is also kind of transcending that boundary also, that only fishermen is not indulge in those things.
Yes, exactly.
Other
And that
people are
responds
also-
to.
Yeah, but it is an individualistic enterprise now.
It is. Yeah.
That is what he's saying.
So I was studying the fishing practices. So if you go back 1970s and before, there was no fishing practices that was individual. The space that I work, in the Bay of Bengal coast, in a place like Chilika Lagoon, which is the largest in Brackish Water Lagoon, there was not a single fishing practices that was individual specific. Like if I want to fish, I cannot do fishing alone. Okay. So now how much it has changed? Now you can do, big fishing single-handedly. What is technological, change? Where did it come from? With aquaculture. Aquaculture brought in, synthetic nets. Aquaculture brought in, technology that allowed people to do fishing on their own. So I'm not relationally connected to others because I can do it. Earlier I would go door to door and then I have a group of people before I go fishing. Okay. You can say, oh, it was very different system, like it was not allowing a single person to do fishing, but those are the relational aspects of, fishing. Now it is more material, I need fishing, I need one element, one technique, and I go and do it. So those changes need to And then the other one is, who is a fisher? A lot of those aquaculture people are not fishers. Okay, so there is an expansion of people that are. I'll give you one. I work on metaphors. So one of the metaphors that I was told is that when the Brahmins try to become fishers, the Brahmins and the Karans, the caste system in India, Brahmins and Karans are the highest. So the Chilika fishers would say, when the Brahmins and the Karans, become fishers, where do we go? That was one of the metaphors I worked. Like when the powerful people, the landed, they have land, they have the other powerhouses that they are in their hand. When they try to become fishers, what do we do? I mean, it's one metaphor explains the whole narrative around how power structures are changing.
Asiatic mode of production.
So we took it and then we started working on it. What does it mean? So 20 years, 30 years back, 1980s, if a Brahmin even touches a fishing net, they have to go take bath, because fishing historically has been a lowly job, only done by lower caste people.
Impure activity.
Indian institution doesn't allow us to kind of use that term now, but they are the lowest caste people.
So
So if you touch or if you engage in fishing or do any fishing, you will be ostracized from your caste. Aquaculture comes, everybody is allowed. Brahmins are the big owners of aquaculture farms. Okay. So what do you study there? You don't study your sustainability. You study those dynamics. You study those intersections. If you want to do good research.
Same case in the ladder work also, sir. As you're saying, how the technology coming up and these caste dimensions are changing with the time. So in the leather works also we can see that.
Yeah.
Let me add to what Prateep was saying. In fact, while we say that it is a dynamic process, like in my area of own research, the Middle Ganga Basin, I've seen that, as recent as 2006, they introduced an act called the Jalkar Act. Now earlier, the state realized, because that's why the role of the state comes in, that the state realized that people who are now involved in fishing are most of the upper caste people, and they were, because the water bodies were leased out, and these were getting the people. I mean, these upper caste people were getting the water fishing rights. Now in 2006, the government ensured that all these wetlands are to be leased out only to the cooperative society of the fishermen. And these fishermen societies are going to be from the fishing communities, the Mallas, and now only the Mallas can do the fishing. Now the change that we see over the years, that from 2006 onwards, I gave you a data, I think yesterday we were talking about that data. From 2006 to 2024 now, the production has increased tremendously, because the Mallas now feel connected to the fishing work. And earlier also they were doing all the fishing work, because all the upper caste people were getting the leasing right, and then they were getting it done through the Mallas. But now that the Mallas themselves are directly the people who are supposed to be getting the direct profit. So that's how, these are, and this is a different situation altogether in a Chilka Lake, or for that matter in other areas. So these are very, there cannot be a single answer to the problems that we face. Every society would have a different challenge. Then states comes in, other societies come in. There were resistance also, because there were a lot of resistance going on from the Malla community about this. That why, these water bodies, they never get it. And we have, in fact, many of the cases during the British period, because once there was a Bengal Fisheries Act, he's worked on that. The Bengal area was, it included both Bihar, Bengal and Odisha, all these three modern states. But when Bengal Act was introduced, the fishermen were not even getting the right to fish in the open water when the flood water comes in. So there were resistance from the fishermen, and then the government had to come up with the Indian Fisheries Act, which had some kind of an amendment to it, which said that now when there'll be a flooded water, anybody could go and do the fishing. So if there is so sometimes it so happens, and it will happen even after, maybe you will see after few years, that this 2006 Act is not going to be the final final change. There could be a further change to it, because then there'll be new problems cropping up in the same society. So I think there are, this is how, as historians also, we see that, there are these dynamisms keep on taking place over the centuries, and that's how the societies react to it. And that's why the changes. So we study the changes. Historians, all the historians study the changes.
Basically, I wrote an article. In this article, I tried to say in the seasonal water, which connected during the flood. In this time, colonial government did not converted it in as a decommunized property.
There are problems associated with these different kinds of resources. In a water situation, we often call it, so there is a lot of fluctuations. So in commons, one would call it as fugitive resources, or mobile, highly mobile resources. So how do you, the challenge of how do you make rules around something that is not, doesn't understand the boundary, like the fish. It doesn't understand the boundary. Your question about the coast salmons going thousands of kilometers away and then coming back to, breed again in the same place. So these are fugitive resources. These are mobile resources, and you cannot have a one stroke of policy that can define how that needs to be managed. So there is always a mismatch between how you make rules. Are your policies and rules as dynamic as the subject of the policy itself? In other words, on which you are making the policies. So there is that confusion most of the time. Like changing rivers, of course you have river courses. Yeah, of course. How do you make rules around a river that changes few kilometers of its course every other year? So what do you do? So these are all challenges, but it's not all dark. It's there are many things in policy as well that comes in. The example that he was giving, 2006, India has the Forest Rights Act, which is despite all of that, colonial history and, history of imposition of, rules and abrogation of rights and all, it is giving out tenure, it is giving out, rights to forest dwellers at the end of the day. So there are many, progressive, things that are happening. So one needs to take into account those things as well. So it's not all dark and blue, blue. What is that? Gloomy.
Sir, I have a
Very quick question.
I want to do work on a reaction of fishermen and during the colonial, against the colonial policy. Colonial record register, but indirectly. So can you suggest some other source or methodology? How can I get the resistance of fishermen against these policies, like there are some organization and all these things?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that. I can say one or two things. One, there is some archival data, records of that. Of course, they would not say what is the nature of resistance. Sometimes the archival data would say there was this peasant revolution or that resistance movement or something. You have to find a roundabout way to interpret the data. For example, you could find out, how many people were jailed.
Yes, I find lots of data, but I want to beyond the archival record.
It depends on what historical time. So I was looking in my work, looking at 100-year or so I still had those elderly people that I could sit down and talk to them, you know. But if you're looking at a 500 year or 300
Yes.
year, then you know that oral history is gone, you know. So you can't do that. But also, depending on the place, there are many private records that are available in villages. So I have a poem that you remember that we published as a book. So I was talking to this 97-year-old. So he said, there was a time when I wrote, I was given by one of the poets this poetry, and it was not a few pages. It was like a 40-page poetry, and because I was asking him how Chilika has changed, and who is responsible, and how you. So he got tired because he's 97. He asked his grandson to bring his whatever bag, and then he gave me this the original. He gave me. He said, I'm going to go away and die and all. So you take it and you can use it in your work. So he gave me that whole. If you read that, of course, it is written in very hard, original Odia language, in a poetic with rhythm and all. If you read it, it tells you the entire history of ecology and societal change in the lagoon itself. So of course, being responsible researchers, I brought in, and then we actually published that that book and distributed in entire Chilika Lagoon and beyond and all. But so there are many of those records that might exist itself. But I will connect you with one of our colleagues that we work with in IIT Kharagpur, Jania, who does a lot of archival work, and more so she has done on Sundarbans, even now as part of another project we are trying to think in terms of sending someone to the British Library in London to collect what is missing. They use a nice term. I don't have my notebook here. Just 2 weeks back we were in a project meeting. They're saying, oh, what a wonderful term that they have. So there is a missing history that they're now saying, because archival records were destroyed, during the transition time. Okay, and some of them were taken to London, and then others were destroyed.
And let me add to it. There are many of the vernacular literature. I think you have to go back to and learn Bengali first of all, because your area is Bengal. So you have to learn Bengali. There are many literatures in Bengali which are indirectly talking about all these problems. I know one of the literatures because I was working on cyclones. So I came across one of the literatures called Pabano Atyachar. And it was about, the problems that the Pabon, that is the wind, creates. And then therein that vernacular literature has a story about a prostitute, and she tells us that when the cyclone comes, how everything has gone destroyed, and the city has got destroyed, and then she's not getting the customers. So there are ways of looking at it. You need to look at those one, and that's why we say that in history also there is a recent trend in historical methodology that we are now including more and more vernacular literatures to understand the changes. Although they are not very direct references as we find in archival sources and the textual account. But I think because what you have done in your PhD work is that you have referred to the court cases, and court cases in some way also refer to those individual cases, representations which are coming to the courts. But these are not enough. I think there is a whole section of a larger section of a fishermen's society which is not actually going to and give any representation or going to the court. So these are well reflected in the vernacular literatures. So I think it is better, the better way to go about it should be for you to go to the these vernacular literatures of the time, 19th century. You have a lot of vernacular literatures coming from 19th century, but you have to first learn Bengali. That is must. Unless until you learn the vernacular, you will not be able to access that, because the translated versions are not the correct one, because the meaning, sometimes those hidden meanings don't really come out for the translator, because the person translating those works are translating in a literal sense, and sometimes all these things go into the background. So you should read those vernaculars in the original language.
Yeah.
I think that's one way you can explore that.
Yeah, in the literature is a great source of
Yeah,
finding.
he's right.
In Chilika, so we all we read it in school. So Radhanath Rai, who is a famous poet, Odia poet, he was going on a train, and then part of that train journey goes just by the Chilika Lagoon. So he wrote, Rohara Khani Baspio Sakata Dekivi Chilika Charu Chitrapato, means hey steam engine, Baspio Sakata. Sakata means Sagada, like the cart, bullock cart. He said, hey bullock, steam engine, stop for a moment, so I would see the Chilika Lagoon, which looks like a sketch, So, and when did he write it? 1800 something, So then okay, so in 1800, that period, Chilika was like a sketch, it was so beautiful and full of, life, So you can track down, through not only archival, but also literature as well as, say. But I will connect you with, the Genia, and you can do
Yeah,
that
yeah,
also,
yeah,
Genia. Genia and the team, they do a lot of archival, historical work, so.
Now I invite sir for his concluding
Acha,
comments and to express our collective thanks also.
So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming here. Thank you Prateep and Derek once again.